So again, I'd like to welcome everybody to History at High Noon, where we are taking a tour through Smith's Villa. Very happy to put this program together. It was an absolute joy. I actually have some strong family connections to Smith Villa. I had a couple of great-grandparents who lived there and raised their children there. And I have another set of grandparents who moved into that neighborhood in the 1950s. So my mom and her brothers and some of my cousins grew up in Smith Villa and actually didn't move until just a few years ago. So I do have a strong connection to this neighborhood, and I hope you really enjoy what I put together here for you all. So saying that, let's get going and see what we have. So, Smith Villa is named for William Remsen Smith. That makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about Smith, his wife, and his children and family. Smith was born in New Jersey in 1828. His parents were Daniel and Elizabeth Bood Smith. He trained to be a harness maker in New York before moving to Macon, Michigan. Smith's father, Daniel, was actually a wheelwright, so they're kind of in the same industry. In Michigan, he did work as a harness maker and as a teacher. He returned to New York around 1849 and studied medicine under Dr. William Detmold. Upon completing his course of study, he returned to Michigan and practiced medicine with Dr. Joseph Howell. A little bit more about Smith. In 1856, Smith left Michigan bound for Sioux City, the infant city on the Missouri River. We were only about a year and a half old when Smith got here in 1856. He practiced medicine in our young city from 1856 to 1867, and he held several U.S. government positions as well during his time in Sioux City, including as a Army surgeon. He was an Army sanitary inspector, and he was receiver for the Sioux City Land Office. In 1859, Smith married Rebecca Osborne of Macon, Michigan. Smith served as mayor of Sioux City a couple of terms, not consecutive terms. They were in 1863 and in 1881. Of course, this when mayoral terms were just 2 years. Smith also served 15 years on the Sioux City School Board, helping to turn that school board and creating the independent school district in 1869, so the district could actually build and own its own permanent buildings. Of course, one of those schools that was built by the independent school district was the original Sioux City High School, later renamed Hunt School, at 5th and Jackson, just across the street from our museum. Smith was involved in other Sioux City ventures as well. Smith was one of the incorporators of the First National Bank at 4th and Douglas. He was involved in railroads with the foundation of the Sioux City and Pacific Railroad, as well as the Sioux City and Pembina Railroad. He was also a charter member of Unity Church, which is the Unitarian church here in Sioux City, which formed in 1885. And he helped the congregation build its first building, which you can see here, the Unity Church at 10th and Douglas. Of course, Smith's great claim to fame is the neighborhood which is named for him and the farm he had built on Sioux City's west side. So this is the William and Rebecca Smith farm. They owned this land from 1866. They would move there and live in 1869. And the farm itself kind of started to, it ended when Smith platted the neighborhood in late in 1885. This drawing is out of the 1875 Andreas Atlas of Iowa. The road right here, this is essentially Rebecca Street. You can see the house here. This would be the same location as the former Smith Elementary School. This would now be in the parking lot in front of the modern-day Liberty Elementary School. This was the William and Rebecca Smith house. They built this structure in 1869 when they moved and actually lived on their farm, and they resided in this house until 1890. Let's talk a little bit about Rebecca Osborne Smith. Rebecca was born in Ovid, New York. That's upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region. Her family, when she was 3 years old, moved to Macon, Michigan. She attended high school there, but finished her education in Rochester, New York. She married William Remsen Smith in Macon on July 12, 1859, and then she moved to Sioux City after that. She was a founding member of the First Christian Church, which formed in 1889. You can see a picture of that building here, which was located at 6th and Park Street in 1894. She was on the board of directors of the Samaritan Hospital, which is one of the predecessors of today's modern Unity Point St. Luke's. She was a founding member of the Zetetic Club, which was founded in 1895. The Zetetic Club was a literary club whose members all happened to be residents of Smith Villa. Speaking of the Zetetic Club, this photograph was taken at their 10th anniversary in 1905. These names were extracted from a newspaper clipping, and of course back then only men's names were listed, so they were Mrs. W.R. Smith and Mrs. M.P. Smith and Mrs. J.C.C. Hoskins. Women did have names. First names, and there's proof. So, there is a legend, a myth about the street names in Smith Villa being the children of William and Rebecca Smith. So let's take a look and see how that plays out and if that is truth or a myth. First child was William. Second was Henry. Then comes along Milton Perry Smith. He is the eldest child to actually live to adulthood. There is Maxwell Smith. There is William Remsen, or Remy Smith. There is Robert Burton Bertie Smith. He was the third child to make it to adulthood. Daniel Emerton Smith. And Arthur Eggleston Smith. Now, none of those street names are really in Smith Villa. Let's check out Dr. Smith's nephews. These are children of Smith's brother Milton Smith, who had passed away, and the 5 children came to live with William and Rebecca Smith here in Sioux City. We have William, Donald, Elizabeth, Hattie, and another Milton. Those street names aren't in the Smith Villa neighborhood. But let's take a look at these kids and see what they did. So Milton Perry Smith was born here in Sioux City in 1866, graduated from Sioux City High School in 1882, served several terms on the city council, served as secretary and treasurer of the Sioux Iron Works, which was later renamed Sioux City Foundry and Boiler Company, which is today's Sioux City Foundry. He served as superintendent of parks and public property. He married Frances Milligan in 1890. The couple resided in Smith Villa at 1705 Rebecca Street. He died in California in 1942 and buried in Inglewood. The other prominent child of William and Rebecca Smith was Robert Henry Burton, or Bertie Smith. He was born here in Sioux City in 1875, started a literary society at Sioux City High School, and graduated in 1892. He left Sioux City for Yale University in 1896. He returned to Sioux City and worked as a history and English teacher here in town. He left Sioux City again to get his law degree at Harvard University. Certainly a learned individual, Yale and Harvard. He again returned to Sioux City after his time at Harvard, and he took work at James F. Toy's Farmers Loan and Trust Company. He served, much like his brother, as an officer with the Sioux Iron Works. He married Leona Brownrigg in 1906, and he died in Sioux City in 1936 and is buried at Floyd Cemetery with all of his siblings who died before and after him, as well as his parents, William and Rebecca, all at Floyd Cemetery. Now let's take a look at the neighborhood. These two maps, the one on the left showing the platted portions of Sioux City in 1881, and the other map showing platted portions in 1884. You can see the maps are relatively similar. In the 1884 map, you kind of have the north side developing areas have been subdivided. The red highlighted area is where Smith's farm was located, and the area which he would later plat into a neighborhood. So let's take a little look about how Smith Villa was platted and how this neighborhood kind of formed in its early formative years. So we have the original Smith's Villa, which was the Smith's 80-acre farm. It was bordered on the south, West 14th on the south, West 21st on the north, Rebecca Street on the east, and West Street on the west. So this 80-acre farm was subdivided for the first time in November of 1885. Really just the area on the south part of Smith Villa between West 16th and West 14th. This was the original Smith development from 1885. That was followed by Smith's Walnut Hill subdivision, which formed in 1888. Those are the blocks right here on the western edge and this portion up here at the north. Now, the name for the Walnut Hill subdivision came from a large walnut tree grove that was in the northwest corner of the property, right up here where it says Private Park. Smith's Walnut Hill second filing was conducted in June of 1901. That would be kind of this central portion of what was the remainder of Smith's property, and Smith would eventually be just kind of located here at the east end of the property on Rebecca Street. The area just south of Smith Villa, which was called Sioux City West, was renamed South Smith Villa in 1905. Smith Villa Second Edition, which is just to the west of the original edition, was platted in 1912. And then the neighborhood just north of that was Smith Villa Heights, and it was platted in 1913. Now for the streets. Where indeed did they get their names? Rebecca Street. That one makes sense. Rebecca Street was named for Rebecca Osborne Smith way back in 1874. However, that name does not actually appear on a Sioux City street map until 1884. George Street was named for George Davis, the son of S.T. Davis and Jane Putnam Davis, in the Davis addition, which is a real estate subdivision that was south of Smith Villa. It had been platted in 1882, before the Smith Villa neighborhood really ever existed. Similarly, Ross Street was named for the Davises' other son. Interestingly, when Smith Villa was platted, Ross Street didn't even show up as Ross Street. It was Ross Street from the Missouri River up to West 14th, and then instead of being Ross Street, it was called Grand Avenue between West 14th and West 19th, and then Dakota Street between West 19th and West 21st. So imagine you're driving up modern Ross Street, and you're on the same road, and the street name changes 3 times. It's a very Sioux City type thing to do. I joke, but you all know it's true. West Street, south of West 14th, was named by S.T. Davis. It was part of his Sioux City West subdivision, and it was named in 1884. And in fact, West Street through the Smith Villa area was actually called Boulevard, later changed to West Boulevard, and finally, in 1911, West Boulevard was named West Street. Now for names that existed and no longer exist, West 14th Street at the southern edge of the villa was named Emerton. That was the middle name of one of the Smith's children, but it was a short-lived name. It was only around from 1885 to 1887. Similarly, West 15th was once upon a time called Smith Place. West 16th was Milton Street for Milton Perry Smith, or Dr. Smith's brother, Milton. Park Place and Park Row on either end of Children's Park, which is right down there, they were later renamed Osborne Street and Remsen Street. So Osborne obviously was Rebecca's maiden name, and Remsen was William Smith's middle name. And finally, the last street name in the neighborhood was West 7th Street, west of Center Street, was renamed Villa Avenue in 1919. Well, that's a little bit about the street names. Speaking of, this actually, I mentioned George Davis, for whom George Street is named. He actually did live in the Smith Villa neighborhood at the corner of West 15th and Ross. So he was living on right by the street that was named for his brother. I suppose that's pretty good. This house was built in 1890. One of the centerpieces of the original plat of Smith Villa was Children's Park. Children's Park, when it was established in 1885, was actually the second city-owned park. The first city-owned park being West Side Park in the original plat of Sioux City along West 4th Street. This is a 1910 photo, and you can see really the focus of this image is the large fountain that once existed in the center of Children's Park. We'll talk more about Children's Park in a little bit. Several neighborhood businesses took on the name of the neighborhood, Smith's Villa Grocery. It's interesting, there were actually 5 different businesses named Smith Villa Grocery over the years. They were by separate owners. They were just a new company that just kind of kept reforming. This happens to be a Smith Villa Grocery that existed around 1910 at 1423 West 7th. This is a wagon of the Smith Villa Grocery. This happens to be a different Smith Villa Grocery owned by an entirely different person, and this is in 1903. So that's pretty fascinating. Smith Villa got its first school in 1891. You can see its historic image there. This is located at 1500 Ross Street. Today, that school building still stands, but is a house. Streetcars, public transportation, moved into the Smith Villa neighborhood when the George Street streetcar line opened in 1897. This image is from 1909, looking south on George Street from West 19th. So, the Smiths had been in this neighborhood now for about 21 years. They decide to build their rather epic mansion, very much in the style of the Pierce Mansion, the former home of the Sioux City Public Museum. It is a South Dakota quartzite Richardsonian Romanesque mansion that was built between 1891 and 1892 for about $25,000. Here's an image of the completed house from around 1908. So the new Smith house, completed in 1892, it is a Richardsonian Romanesque style building. This one happened to be designed by local architect Fred M. Sterling and built by local contractor George Hawson. Now I'm going to, throughout this show, I will be talking about some architectural styles through the neighborhood. These are just some aspects of what is a Richardsonian Romanesque building. Roughly surfaced ashlar masonry, so we get that. We see the rounded Romanesque arches. We'll see steeply pitched roofs. On dormers and gables, we will see parapet walls, meaning the walls extend up beyond the pitch of the roof. We'll also see rounded towers. In this case, we have 2, and we have a square tower as well. And we'll often see short, squat columns supporting archways. So this is the Smith house. It, of course, would become a school in 1899. So a new Smith Villa school opened as the neighborhood was growing and there were more children. William Smith died in 1894. His widow sold the house to the school district for $15,000 in 1899. The view of the school here actually shows an addition that was built on the north end of the building, designed by George W. Burkhead and built in 1910. Now we start kind of the second part of this talk, which is an actual walk through the neighborhood. We're going to be taking a look at some of the homes and the architecture and a little bit about the people who built them. This is right across from the former Smith School, 1620 Rebecca Street, built by Edwin Thompson in 1904. Thompson had started a drugstore way back in 1891 that still exists today, Thompson Dean Drug. This house is a late Queen Anne Victorian. Queen Anne Victorian really had its era of popularity from the 1870s up to about 1900, but details of that form lingered on into the early part of the 20th century as well. We'll see steeply pitched roofs. We'll see irregularly shaped roofs, largely because we have things like towers and bays and things to break up surfaces. And as for wall claddings or exterior wall claddings, you'll see other devices used to break up those surfaces, things like different patterned clapboards and shingles, and you'll also see bay windows and towers. Anything to break up surfaces. You'll see a lot more Victorian houses in this talk. Just to the south, we're moving along. This is 1610 Rebecca Street, built by John G. Herman in 1910. Now, Herman had started a grocery store on the west side in 1899. He also took temporary work occasionally with the city, and he was hired as an inspector for a large-scale paving project on West 7th Street in 1897. Now, the style of this house is a prairie school style house, also known as a prairie box or simply an American four-square. It's a really common form of architecture we see all over Sioux City and really all over the Midwest as well. You'll see a low pitch, so a kind of a shallow pitched, hipped roof. That means it's hipped, so it's kind of pyramid in shape. You'll often see a hipped dormer like we see on the front of the roof in this building. We'll see horizontal banding like that around the top of the first floor, as well as the frieze around the top of the second floor beneath the eaves. Anything to express the horizontal nature of the prairie. Prairie school is all about having your building fit in with the nature in which it was built. These homes often feature a full width front porch, often with large columns. That is kind of absent in this particular structure. But this is basically a prairie box. Moving down the street is 1522 Rebecca Street. This was the Sadie Weiss house built in 1907. Now, Sadie was the widow of George Weiss. Weiss and a guy named Mull started a farm implement business here in Sioux City in 1883. And Sadie and her husband George were some of the earliest residents of Smith Villa, building their first house there in 1886. This house is also a late Queen Anne Victorian. We'll see the steep, irregularly shaped roof. You see bay windows, and even a Palladian window. That is the arched window in the dormer, flanked by two rectangular windows. That's a Palladian window, and we'll see a couple more of those as we move along through the program. Speaking of the Weisses, this is actually their earliest house, 1503 Rebecca Street, built in 1886. Now, this house has been significantly modified at one point. I don't know if there's a fire or whether it was just a general remodeling, but the original house would have had a very identifiable mansard roof, like the one you can see here in the lower right-hand corner. So imagine instead of this kind of shallow pitched prairie-style type roof, you have a mansard-style roof, really typical of this era. That kind of architecture would be. The original house was designed by a relatively obscure local architect named L.C. Fay and built by contractors Payette and Babway for $4,000. I want to kind of look at some of the other really early residents of Smith Villa. Some of you might be familiar with this 1888 perspective map. Now, these kind of maps were made for cities all over the country and internationally as well. It's an artistic depiction of Sioux City or any given town from an aerial perspective. What's so neat about these is their accuracy. So Smith Villa is in the far left corner, right up here. And I want to zoom in to show you how detailed these maps can be. So, in this photo, we can see the original Smith homestead here. We can see the George and Sadie Weiss house. We can see the John Osborne, Henry Osborne, and James Turnbull houses right here. We can see the Lycurgus Wakefield house right here, a speculative property built by, there is a speculative property right here. There is the house of F.M. Sterling. There's the house of Joshua Wood, and the home of Dr. Nathan N.E. Wood, way up there at West 17th and West Street. So it's just and these houses in this drawing look like the houses in real life. So let's take a look at some of those houses in real life. This is the Sophia Strauss house, built in 1886 at the corner of West 15th and Ross. Brothers William and Otto Strauss, who were proprietors of the Sioux City Wire Works, built this house for their mother. Now, this is an Italianate-style house, has a shallow pitched roof, hipped roof, often having a flat top roof. Sometimes that might be topped by a cupola. You'll often see wide overhangs, sometimes with brackets underneath the eaves. Italianate houses are almost always two-story, and they usually feature tall, narrow windows. This is the Joshua Wood house at 1503 West 14th Street, built in 1887. This is a Victorian-style house. Another one of those early houses was the Henry D. Osborne house, built in 1888 at 1407 Rebecca Street. Now, Osborne was a Civil War veteran. He came to Sioux City to work in our burgeoning real estate industry. He also happened to be the brother of Rebecca Osborne Smith, and he would reside in this house for the next 30 years until his death in 1917. This is another Italianate house with a shallow pitched tiff roof, 2 floors, tall, narrow windows. Just a couple houses north of that is 1423 Rebecca Street. This house is another Italianate style house built in 1888. This one by John Osborne, the son of Henry Osborne and the nephew of Rebecca Osborne Smith. It's a whole family neighborhood, isn't it? Moving back up to Rebecca Street to continue our little walking tour, this is the Charles M. Dixon house built in 1910 at 1520 Rebecca Street. Dixon was a native of Scotland. He moved to Sioux City and started a barber supply business here in 1897 and operated until his death in 1942. That's also how long he lived in the house he built here. This is another Queen Anne style Victorian house. 1509 Rebecca Street is the William Kiefer house, built in 1890. Kiefer was an attorney. He was employed by a couple of different railroads at different times, by the Milwaukee Road and later the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. He also served as Woodbury County Treasurer for a time. The Kiefers resided here until 1935. Now, about one of my connections to the neighborhood, my grandparents, J. Orion Scott and Ardis Aronson Scott, resided in this house from 1938 to 1963. Their children, which would be my grandparents' generation, they kind of grew up in this house. They were older teenagers when they lived here. This house was destroyed by fire just a few years ago. And this is another Queen Anne style Victorian. This one also designed by F.M. Sterling. That's a name we've seen a couple times already, and we'll see his name keep reoccurring. Again, we see the steeply pitched roof, we see towers, we see incised ornaments, we see archways, we see pilasters. Victorians, again, this kind of style of architecture, anything to break up surfaces. Just to the north of the Kiefer house is the J.C.C. Hoskins house, built in 1892. Now, Hoskins came to Sioux City very early in 1857. He was an engineer by trade, but he served the city and county in just about every capacity he could as city surveyor, postmaster, county surveyor, county sheriff, mayor, and justice of the peace. This is another Queen Anne Victorian style house designed by F.M. Sterling. This is as the house would have looked around the time it was built. We can see the house really didn't change very much. This is a photo of the house probably from the 1990s. Yes, we've lost the porch, we've lost some detailing, but overall, the house is still relatively intact with some of its Victorian details. This house was demolished for the construction of the new Liberty Elementary School. Immediately behind the Hoskins house is the house of Lycurgus and Mary Wakefield, built in 1887 at 510 George Street. Lycurgus Wakefield was an attorney, and he was involved, like so many other people, in Sioux City's real estate. His wife, Mary, was a daughter of J.C.C. Hoskins. So we have the parents living on the backside and children living on this side. This, again, is another Italianate-style house. This one is only different from the other Italianates that we've seen, as this has a front-facing gable there on the left-hand side of that image. If we turn around from 1510 George Street, we see Children's Park. So, as I mentioned, Children's Park started in 1885 with the original platting of Smith Villa. But nothing was really done much to maintain this land or improve it until 1896, when the Herman and Savage Iron Works installed a fence and gate around the park, and that was in 1896. There was once upon a time a cannon, a small Spanish-American War cannon that was on display in the park. It had been captured by W.C. Davidson, who gave it to the city in 1900. The cannon was installed then in the park in 1904 after Davidson had died in a battleship explosion earlier in that year. The gentleman in the postcard has really nothing to do with that story. It's just a postcard. And of course, one of the main features also of Children's Park is the Smith Villa Branch Library, this particular building opening in November of 1927. Here is an interior of the Smith Villa Branch Library there in Children's Park. If we turn north out of Children's Park, we see 1513 George Street. This was a speculative property built by William Remsen Smith back in 1887. The idea was that he built some houses for people so they're just ready to move into and probably make a little bit of a profit and to promote his neighborhood. Moving a little bit farther over, we've kind of crossed over an alley and we see 1512 West 16th. This was the Frederick Miller Sterling House built in 1887. So I've already mentioned his name a bunch, so it's about time we actually talk a little bit about Fred Sterling. Sterling was born in New York in 1849. He came to Sioux City, and he set up work here as a contractor and architect in 1886. He and his 10 children and his parents were all residents of Smith Villa. You can see just a couple of the places he designed, including the 1888 Mayflower Congregational Church. We've already seen this Hoskins House and the Kiefer House. These are two other houses that I'm not going to really mention, but these are Smith Villa houses. But I know for sure that he designed at least 25 houses in the Smith Villa area, and I'm inclined to believe quite a bit more. This is 1522 Ross Street, the Louis Trudell House, built in 1914. Trudell came to Sioux City with his family. They were wagon and carriage makers. Trudell was he the painter in that business? He was the painter in that business. The factory closed in 1885, at which time he went on to work for the Sioux City Street Railway Company, which operated horse-drawn streetcars in Sioux City, and he painted the streetcars at that point, which he did for the next 40 years. This is kind of an interesting combination of architectural styles, both neoclassical and craftsman. The neoclassical is all in this front-facing dormer with the columns, these kind of pilasters here, and the oval window up top. The brick piers and the exposed rafter tails are elements of craftsman style. This house at 1603 Ross Street was another speculative property built by Smith in 1888. Again, we have another Queen Anne Victorian, but what's special about this one, if we go towards the bottom, we see there's a lot of spindle work. That's the kind of the stick-built work that you see. Now, there are other names for this spindle work. Sometimes it's called gingerbread. Sometimes it's called Eastlake design, named for English furniture maker Charles L. Eastlake, pardon me. Crossing the street from that property is 1604 Ross Street. This is the Fred Sargent House, built in 1901. So attorney Fred Wesley Sargent came to Sioux City. He was employed as a city attorney for a while. He left Sioux City and served as legal counsel for the Omaha Railroad and later the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and he would serve as president of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad from 1925 to 1939. Now we'll see a lot of colonial rival gambrel variant houses in this neighborhood. This one is designed by Sterling. Now what is colonial revival? That is just a major architectural movement from 1880 to the 1930s. But what's important here is the gambrel, and that is essentially this barn-shaped roof. And there are a lot of these houses in the Smith Villa neighborhood, and we'll see more of them in a little bit, trust me. Across the street, this is 1613 Ross. This is the John Milligan House, built in 1892. William Smith built this house, but had an intended purchaser, John and Carrie Milligan. The Milligan's daughter married Milton Perry Smith, son of William and Rebecca, in 1891. So again, it's a total family affair. Across the street from that is 1620 Ross, the William C. Price House, built in 1903. Price was a clerk, and later department manager at the wholesale grocery business of William Tackaberry. This is another colonial revival with the gambrel variant. Again, the key here is the barn-shaped roof. So now we're going to take a little diversion from our little walking tour and take a look at all the gambrel houses in the Smith Villa neighborhood, including 1812 George Street. This was a speculative property built by F.M. Sterling in 1902. A couple more. Here's 1804 George Street and 1819 Isabella Street. These are two pictures of the same house, 1524 Isabella Street, the Arthur C. Sterling house, built in 1904. Arthur was the eldest son of Fred Sterling, Fred and Sophia Sterling. You can see the one photo from about 1904 and the photo on the right from about 1990. This is 1801 George Street, the C.C. Moore house, built in 1904. We have 1811 Rebecca and 1512 Isabella, built in 1905 and 1908, again featuring the gambrel design. And I believe these are the last two I'm going to take a look at. This is 1913 Ross, the T.H. Fritchoff house, and 1423 West 19th, the E.B. Jones house. Moving back to Ross Street, this is 1624 Ross. This is the home of George W. Graves, who along with Merrill Orr started a heating and plumbing business, Orr and Graves. Mrs. Graves, Lydia Treadwell, Graves married Lydia Treadwell. The Treadwells actually lived a couple houses south of this. This home is a craftsman-style house. We'll often see full-width porches with large brick columns. We're missing the large brick columns. We do have some exposed rafter tails on this house, which is a key element of that style of architecture. And then we have a little bit of Tudor influence here on the gable end, where you can see the half timbering here with the stucco installed in between the half timbering. Moving up the street is 1701 Ross. This is the Fred Lurch house, built in 1899. Lurch came to Sioux City with his family. He trained at the Sioux City College of Medicine and trained as a pharmaceutical chemist. He operated his own pharmacy for over 40 years. This is another small example of a Queen Anne Victorian. But what's kind of neat about this house, aside from the tower there on the right, is the very steeply pitched dormer on the left side, which is kind of reminiscent of the Gothic Revival style of architecture. Moving up the street is 1713 Ross, the Charles Roberts house, built in 1889. Attorney Charles Roberts resided in this home with his son Hugh, who was another attorney, and his son Samuel, a druggist. 1723 Ross Street is the W.W. Sterling house, built in 1890. We're going to get sick of hearing the name Sterling. Not really. William Wiltshire Sterling was a traveling agent for a nursery business, and he was the father of F.M. Sterling. They built this house in 1890. This is a Queen Anne Victorian style home. Now I'm going to kind of digress a little bit again, and we're going to look at houses in the neighborhood that look like this, that all have kind of a Victorian tower, including that previous house's twin. This is 1813 Isabella Street, the Alfred Brown house, built in 1890. These houses are identical with the exception of a modified porch. This one has the full porch like it's supposed to. The other house was missing a big chunk of its original porch. Two other twins, 1903 and 1907 Rebecca Street. These homes were built as speculative properties by William Smith in 1890. The first owners of each of these houses were Frank Edwards and Joseph Lye. Similar, we kind of have a tower here on this home at 1821 Ross Street. This is probably a speculative property built by W.W. Sterling in 1890, and of course designed by his son, Fred. This is 1624 West 19th, the C.S. Sterling house, built in 1891. Now, Charles was a carpenter for his older brother's contracting business. Of course, his older brother was F.M. Sterling. This house would go on to be the home of Sorenstad's Hillside Sanatorium, which was predecessor of the West Side Sanatorium, the Osteopathic Hospital, and the later Gordon Memorial Hospital. You can actually see the hospital there in the far left background. And then another house with a tower, 2001 George Street, the J.F. Neubauer House, 1891. And 1717 Isabella Street, the D.L. Pratt House in 1890. Here we can see a historic drawing of that house from 1892, and then a modern image. Honestly, it looks pretty similar other than that second floor balcony being having been removed. 1701 Isabella is another one of these Victorian-style houses with a tower. This is the T.H. Johnson House, built around 1891. Telemachus H. Johnson was an engineer, paving contractor, and considered one of the fathers of concrete paving. He was experimenting with concrete paving, as were other communities around the United States. But he was he actually paved many of Sioux City's concrete streets. He built this house around 1891, but look where he built it, 32nd and Myrtle Streets. The house was moved back into town in 1897. We're going to see this for the next couple of slides. In the 1890s, real estate prices in the center of Sioux City were so expensive that you'll see people building these kind of Victorian houses in the outskirts, in land that was cheaper. Then we hit the panic of 1893, and real estate prices drop. So houses that were built kind of in the countryside were moved back in closer to town. That's exactly what happened with this house. And in fact, it happened with this house as well. This is the T.C. Prescott House, built in 1891. Prescott was a Civil War veteran. He was in the real estate business. He was on the Sioux City School Board, but he moved this house from the Highland Park neighborhood in 1899. Now, Highland Park is in a neighborhood that really doesn't so much exist anymore, but think of the area west of West High School, near modern Fire Station number 8 on West 19th Street, is about where this house used to be. Another building moved in, 1923 George Street. This 1891 house was actually originally built as the Jones Street station of the Elevated Railroad. During the Elevated Railroad's deconstruction in 1902, this building was moved here and converted into a house. And if you think that's the best story about a house moving into the neighborhood, well, it might be, but the next one is just as good. 1611 West 15th. You're not reading that date wrong, 1859. Prior to the Smith Villa and the William and Rebecca moving there, they lived at 707 Douglas Street, which is the house you see there on the left. The house had been built by a land agent named S.P. Yeomans way back in 1859. When the Smiths platted their new neighborhood in 1885, this house was moved to 1611 West 15th, where it still stands. This makes this the second oldest house in Sioux City after Bruyer's Cabin, and the oldest stick frame built house in Sioux City. Not only house, but building in general. Getting back to Ross Street, we're continuing our little walking tour. This is the James E. Talbot House, built in 1904. Talbot had come to Sioux City in 1883. He worked for a string of small grocers. He and his wife, Lola, lived in this house for many years. Talbot died in 29, but his wife lived here until 1947, at least 1947. Now, the Talbots were not new to this neighborhood when they built that house in 1904, because this is the house they had built in Smith Villa in 1891 at 1614 West 19th Street. Crossing West 19th at Ross, this is the Warren Sellers House, built in 1905. Sellers was part owner of the Harvey Laundry Company. He was active in the area's real estate and owned a couple of apartment buildings, including the Shepherd Flats on Pierce Street. This is a late Queen Anne Victorian. I really don't need to point out some of these elements, but there's above the entrance to the porch, and you'll see that also the Palladian window on the dormer up top, and above that entrance you see some incised carving work. Moving along on West 19th, we come to 1901 George Street, the George Hollister House, built in 1891. Hollister was a mortgage banker and receiver for the Farmers Loan and Trust Company. His wife, Maud Whitney Hollister, was a founding member of the Zetetic Club, and she served on the board of the Boys and Girls Home. Moving down George Street, this is the Garrett J. Davilar House, built in 1905. Davilar had a decorating and wallpaper business with his father, John B. Davilar. Davilar also lived in this neighborhood. Across the street from that is 1818 George Street, the William S. Guard House, built around 1905. William and his brother Frank had started a wood, coal, and hay business in 1900 along West 7th Street. Frank Guard also lived in this neighborhood, and we actually just saw his house a little bit ago. This house is actually built out of concrete block. This would be very, very early use of concrete block. This house also has kind of a twin in the neighborhood. If we hop over to Rebecca Street, we see 1711 Rebecca Street, the William Hoole House, built in 1905. Now, Hoole had a retail shoe shop dating back to the 1880s. He and his wife moved into the neighborhood in 1900, and they built this house in 1905. This is probably Sioux City's earliest residential example of a house built out of concrete block. Moving back to George Street, we see the J.A. Berry House. John Berry came to Sioux City in 1893. He was legal counsel for the wholesale grocery firm of Tollerton and Stetson. He practiced law privately starting in 1898, eventually retiring 42 years later. His wife Hattie was a longtime member of the Martha Washington Post chapter of the DAR. This house was designed by F.M. Sterling. Now I talk about similar houses. This house has several twins in the neighborhood as well. It's a two-story, which we kind of see this second floor bump out and a front porch. So let's take a look at some of the other houses in the neighborhood that looked like this. Like 1805 Isabella, the Loftus Cathcart House, built in 1902. And 1611 George Street, the Thomas B. Moore House, also built in 1902. And 1800 George Street, the E.A. Kruckman House, built in 1906. And 1724 Rebecca Street, the C.W. Britton House, built in 1907. Hopping back to George Street, this home was built by Robert W. Orcutt in 1902. Orcutt came to Sioux City, and he ended up working for two of the largest department stores in Sioux City, both the Davison Brothers and T.S. Martin Company. Orcutt also was involved in establishing the local Lions Club here in Sioux City and served as its first president. This is a folk Victorian, which is similar to a Queen Anne Victorian. You'll see the same kind of detail, just not much of it, and they are far more modest in size, tending to be 1 or 1.5 story homes. The next couple of slides are of folk Victorians right in a row on George Street, including 1720 George, the Walter Hunt House, and 1710 George, the E.J. Brown House, built in 1901, designed by F.M. Sterling. Just to the south of this house is 1906 George Street, the C.L.O. Chesterman House, built in 1901. Of course, the Chesterman name will be familiar to many of you. C.L.O., along with Fred Barrow, opened a bottling works here in Sioux City in 1885. That is today simply Chesterman and Company. We're going to squeeze by and go down an alley, and now we're back on Rebecca Street. 1705 Rebecca Street is the Milton Perry Smith House, built in 1890, designed by architect Fred Sterling. Here is an interior of this particular Smith House, as well as the architectural drawing of that particular building. We have several other copies or several other plans of the house, including the first and second floor and some elevations, again by F.M. Sterling in 1890. Looking across the street, we see 1706 Rebecca Street, the Charles M. Feist House, built in 1910. Now, Feist came to Sioux City and was employed by the Sioux City Street Railway Company. He was involved in maintaining the streetcars back when they were still horse-drawn. He continued in that line of work for another 40 years. And Feist built several houses in Smithville other than this one, including 1510 West 14th, 720 Rebecca Street, and 1800 Rebecca Street. Now, this house is a colonial revival with a hipped roof and a full front porch variant. These homes would be designed in a symmetrical manner. You can see the porch columns. They have little Ionic capitals on the top of them, so they are a classical column. And the pedimented dormer and roof. So basically, that would be the little cross gable you see above the main entrance, and then again on the dormer in the attic of the house. Moving up the street, we have another little folk Victorian, this one belonging to Willard Merton Orcutt. And he and his brother, W.W. Orcutt, started the Ochsner and Orcutt Wholesale Hardware Company in 1890. Now, Willard led that business until its closure in 1952. He and his wife, Lydia, lived in this folk Victorian house until 1953. Just to the north of that is 1810 Rebecca Street, the A.A. Rader House, built in 1914. Arlie Rader was a clerk for the Railroad Mail Service for 32 years. This is a full-on craftsman-style house with a full-width front porch, brick piers under the columns. We can see exposed rafter tails and decorative brackets supporting the roof line. A very nice little craftsman-style house. What's neat about this, we actually have some family photos of this family, and they show some street scenes across the street. I know we've kind of been looking at more modern color images, but here's a view from the Raiders' front porch. We see 1815 Rebecca Street, 1817, and 1821 Rebecca Street all across the street from the Raiders. And to remind you that winter is just around the corner, here they are playing in the front yard. And you can see a couple other houses across the street in the background, including 1803 Rebecca Street, 1811, and 1815. Moving just a little bit farther north on Rebecca Street is the William Bullard House, built in 1891. Boulevard, like so many others, was involved in Sioux City's real estate landscape. He and his brother Orlin, also lived in Smith Villa at 1401 Rebecca Street, a house he built there in 1888. Now, the front of this house has been significantly modified. It kind of looks like a 1930s style house, but you can see on the left side of the image, that third floor dormer, that used to not just have a gable end, that used to be a tower there, and the whole front of this house was added on at some point. It was originally a Queen Anne Victorian. There were several churches in the neighborhood. Of course, this one happened to be right on our path. 1407 West 18th Street, Mayflower Congregational Church, designed by Beutler and Arnold, and built in 1924. And finally, we have the 1721 Rebecca Street house of John C. French, built in 1888. Now, French had come to Sioux City the year prior. He was vice president of the Fidelity Loan and Trust Company, as well as founder of the Corn Exchange Bank. French is one of those people who, once the panic hit, was out of town. He lived in this house for about 5 years. And much like the Smith House, which we saw early on in the program, this is a Richardsonian Romanesque style building designed by Charles Porter Brown and built by contractor George Hawson. Again, we see the roughly cut stone, the rounded Roman arches, steeply pitched roof, parapeted dormers and gables, and rounded towers, and this one we even get a spire. So, we have just been on a whirlwind tour of Smith Villa. I am so happy you joined us. I hope you learned something fascinating, because I know I certainly did while I was putting this together. So, thank you for coming, and questions, concerns, comments?